Welcome, dear friends, to this house of precious memory and abiding hope. We come together here to remember, to mourn, to celebrate, and to give thanks for the life of Terence Staples Millar. We meet here in the presence of death to pay tribute to the spirit of life and to give thanks for a generous, compassionate, inquisitive, and loving soul. Terry Millar graced this planet for 70 years, sharing his positivity, his wonder and joy with each and all, inspiring those around him with his curiosity, his sincere heart, his vibrant appreciation of life itself. Throughout these years, Terry enjoyed many of life's most breathtaking pleasures and experienced and relished many of its wonders. And so we gather to mourn a life lost, yet also to celebrate a life redeemed, a life astonishingly beautiful, a life fulfilled. These are the words of Richard Wolff. It is not what the world gives me in honor, praise, or gold. It is what I do give the world, so others do unfold. If by work through life I can another soul unfold, then I have done what cannot be made good by praise or gold. One tiny thought in tiny word may give a great one birth. And if that thought was caused by me, I lived a life of worth. As we gather this day, we know that a man who lived a life of worth has passed on to places unknown and unknowable. Yet we are here to express our confidence that the powers which uplift and sustain this amazing universe preserve and protect him still. For never has such a force of joy and enthusiastic love of life touched the face of earth without creating something eternal. To Terry, to all that he gave and all he loved, we dedicate this service of memory and hope. And I invite Terry's grandchildren to come forward to kindle our memorial flames as we join together in the words printed in your program. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of the man we commemorate today who lighted a flame within us. Thank you. "70 years ago, on September 18, 1948, Terry Millar came into this world, and the world was forever changed for the better. Since a young age, Terry was filled with a passionate and voracious love of life and learning, a life defined by the excitement of discovery and the greatest gift of a steadfast and unshakable love. Like many of you, when I saw that CaringBridge post on March 9th, I could not wrap my mind around the words I was seeing on the screen. How could Terry, a force of nature, a man with legendary energy and passion and such a strong spirit, be gone? How could that bright and shining light be out? For we all know that Terry never did anything halfway. He gave his whole self to anything he believed in: family, mathematics, athletics, improving this life for all. making the most of this precious gift of life that had been granted to him. At the age of 8, Terry's next-door neighbor showed him a telescope, and he saw Saturn with his own eyes. He realized in that moment that there was so much more in this universe to explore, so much more to try and understand, and he was determined to explore and understand it all. His love of mathematics was boundless. The University of Wisconsin, where Terry served as professor since 1975 and as an associate dean for decades, had this to say. Terry was one of the world's most foremost researchers in computable model theory, a branch of mathematical logic, and is remembered by UW colleagues as a mathematician with a mind that never hit pause. Terry was always full of ideas about how mathematics could be a powerful and useful tool. He'd have a vision of what needed to be done, used logic to make his case, and was tireless in seeing his vision through to reality. This determination was fueled by his tremendous energy, his creativity, and balanced with a marvelous and self-deprecating sense of humor. And then there was his ferocious love and devotion to his family. Terry once said that if he had a gravestone, he would like it to read, "Here lies a family man." Terry and Susan met in the 4th grade, began dating when they were 15, and loved one another deeply through 50 years of marriage. As I was reflecting on Terry and my experiences with him here, I recalled a day when I was sitting across the hall in our kitchen, and I looked through the window, and there in the Commons came Terry and Susan. They were ballroom dancing down the hall. The sight of them brought so much love and joy to my heart that I realized I was smiling from ear to ear and laughing out loud at the sheer pleasure of seeing two people greatly enjoying life in a moment of dancing in a church hallway. And many a Sunday morning, Terry would sit right here behind me with grandson Sterling on his lap, and I could overhear Terry whispering to him throughout the service. The love and devotion that came through in those words was profound, and it was clear that Grandpa was perhaps one of the most important titles this man had ever held. Terry was a storyteller through and through, and one of the defining stories of his life was his time in the Marines in Vietnam. In 1967, Terry received his assignment letter for his tour in Vietnam. He was given the assignment of Forward Artillery Scout, a position that held a life expectancy of 2 weeks. Terry stared at that paper and couldn't understand the words that were written upon it. He went to his sergeant and said, "Sir, what does this mean?" And the sergeant laughed heartily and said, "Millar, this means you're going to die, Millar." So Terry used every resource at his disposal to find another way, because he wanted to live. He wanted to make it home to Susan. He wanted them to make a life together. So he ran. He ran for 12 miles to get his test scores, and he brought them to a major who was quite fond of him. That major got his test scores into a pile that allowed Terry into Vietnamese school, and he learned that language, and he spent his time driving kids home from the hospital. He was given a death sentence, and he found a crack in that story. He found a way to make it through. He used his creativity, his energy, his brilliance to find another way for that story to end. That moment in Vietnam defined him then, and it defined him 18 months ago when the diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer arrived at his door. He was running right until the end, looking for a way to continue living this life he so deeply loved, using his creativity, his energy, his brilliance, and also the amazing resources at his disposal, especially the immense love and devotion and brilliance of this family he and Susan created. Terry always believed he was given a 51-year extension on his life, a gift he never expected to have, and a gift he was not going to squander or take for granted. Terry made the most of this gift, living his life with passion, finding delight in the smallest of things, fiercely loving his family, building an amazing career that contributed in innumerable ways to this world we share. So as we hear the stories today, may we have hearts filled with gratitude for the impact Terry has had on our world and on our lives. For 70 years, he walked among us, and now it is up to us to carry that voracious love of life, the glorious outpouring of life that was Terry Millar, with each of us as we move forward in our days. May Terry continue to inspire us to enter each day with a generous heart, to serve the call of courage and love, to find beauty and laughter. Terry, we will take all these gifts that you have given to us and carry them with us always.
I'm going to play a few selections from Bach's First Suite, about 10 minutes. Different playing without my biggest fan. Dad, you asked me to play this at your memorial, so here goes. I'm going to skip to the last two movements. I was lucky enough to be there when my dad was dying, and this was the last music that he heard. I played the whole Bach suite up until the second to last movement, and we got interrupted there. So I'm going to pick up where I left off and finish it up. One last thing I'd like to say about my dad, just to honor him as a father. When I played cello for him, I felt like he enjoyed it so much, and my mom, but it just felt, I oftentimes went to a place where it just felt sublime, and a lot of times when I played in other circumstances, it wasn't necessarily how I felt. The playing of music it's like both the performer and the people listening, and it's an active relationship. So, yeah, thank you, Dad, and that was one of the ways that he made me feel sublime. That was one of the ways that he blessed me, gave me my father's blessing.
I'm going to say one thing quick about my brother, which is I play violin, and I remember I was working on some violin concerto. And I came home, and I heard the violin concerto, and it sounded kind of low, and it was because my brother had learned it by ear on his cello. I also remember having a similar experience of going to university and realizing that not everybody liked listening to scales, including my upstairs neighbors. But Dad sure did. It was pretty wonderful. So, yeah, maybe I am going to go over here a second. Thanks, Sterling. So thank you all for coming. This is going to be hard for several reasons. The main reason being there's just so much to say about my dad. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I'm going to talk here. I'm going to talk for the first part, not too long, but maybe a third, about the last 17 months since his diagnosis. And then I'm going to be celebrating the first 69 years we got. You know, technically speaking, I maybe only got 46 of those, but yeah, so we got the cancer diagnosis, and we all, including my dad, had these ripples go by, you know, shock, fear, disorientation. But we huddled up and we decided to go for it. Yeah, so that's a picture of a man 1 week after a stage 4 pancreatic cancer diagnosis. That was some cancer gadget I bought for him, which is a lot of fun. And he just thought he was tickled, as you can tell. And he was also just ready for the next great adventure with his family. And really a lot happened in the last 17 months that were a man living his life. That was fantastic. Probably 1,600 holes of Frisbee golf since diagnosis, including all through a brutally cold winter. He went to, there was the Badger Honor Flight that celebrated people who'd served, and he went on that, and was very touched by that, as well as letters written by a lot of loved ones and friends, many of whom are in this audience. There was a Packers game that he went to with my brother, and coincidentally, it turned out they had like a Packers fighting cancer thing going on that day, which was awesome. He continued doing work at Moses, which is prison reform, a cause that he and my mother and a lot of people at the Unitarian Church here are deeply committed to, especially because it involved some technical stuff in math. Figured out a way to make that happen. And on that note, he did grandpa math with both of my girls and others, I expect, but it was something both Laura and Sarah loved, and he did too. There was a 50th wedding anniversary that brought together both the Bolliard and Millar side of the family, and it was just fantastic at Leslie and Chip's place. I made the cake with a recipe from a friend of mine. It was very tasty, and Laura helped, especially with the frosting. Because we were going for it and spending a lot of time doing research on cancer and figuring out how to handle coming up with something other than standard prognosis, he also did a lot of re-educating of cancer doctors, something that he got into with a great deal of enthusiasm, especially when it involved math. So one of the things that he would often tell cancer doctors was he wanted to expand the variance, even if it meant he would land on the wrong side of the standard deviation, which, by the way, he decidedly did not. Average life expectancy when you have stage 4 pancreatic cancer is about 9 to 11 months. And I guess I'm going to also mention that one of the favorite things he did was just live and do something I think he's been doing since probably he was able to form a thought, which is really ask with eyes wide open, what's going on with math and physics and the universe and reality? So he dove back into physics books that he hadn't read in a long time. He actually, at the prompting of some good friends, also looked a bit at how history might be involved in all of this. And really, on a number of scales, including with Qigong, with my mom and me, and a number of internal searching types of things, really was on this expanding quest about math, physics, and reality. And that was just a joy. That was super fun. That was actually intertwined with the whole surviving cancer thing. And I'm going to say that he really did get into surviving cancer. This is, I admit, inflict about 200 pills on him per day. And this was him, I think, saying to Zach, "Goody, goody, here's breakfast." Yeah. I think this picture is a good segue to what I want to say, which is, so my dad died when he was 70. But this is not a memorial for a 70-year-old. It's not a memorial for an old man. This is a memorial for a 5-year-old and for a 15-year-old and for a 25-year-old. That's me. And that's one of the things that is making this memorial so important, because we have to, as humans, ask why and figure out what this means and piece reality back together. But I just want to say that all of these parts of him, this young energy, has been in, like, he actually, maybe there was 10 or 15 years where he got a little bit tricked by the kinds of things we often get tricked by in terms of adult life being serious, and you don't have to put on a hard exterior, et cetera. But he was really unwinding that, I think, especially with his grandpa title. That really meant that he started going back to dialing in what it was like to be 5, out there exploring with the squirrels and the trees and seeing what kind of trouble he could get into. So I'm going to tell a story, since he tells stories. And I hope you guys appreciate that I'm putting some math into this with that. I'll do that again. But this is a story that he didn't tell very often. In fact, I didn't hear it until near the end of his life when we were in Germany together. And it's a story about Vietnam. He, as Kelly said, what he actually did was drive kids home from the hospital. And often that was a beautiful and uplifting and celebratory occasion, but there was one time when he had to drive a mother and her dead 7-year-old home to their village. And the mother just kept saying why the entire time. So they got to the village, and he took off all of his army fatigues. And he helped the mom carry her dead son to the village, and he helped the village bury their boy. And again, I think this is something he had in him from when he was 3, but that just strikes me as part of that story is important to the story of my dad, in terms of him saying that math and physics and the universe is a birthright for every child on this planet. Which is something we can all remember from him, and when we actively remember that, we are honoring my dad. So I want to say cancer can often be a slow, spirit-sucking, painful slide into oblivion. And pancreatic cancer is an extremely challenging diagnosis. So what I want to say also is that it can be very painful, and that it wasn't most of the time for my dad. And that when faced with this kind of nearly impossible challenge, families can get blown apart. But what happened to our family was the opposite of that. All 6 of the pairwise relationships out of 4 people, so if you think 4 choose 2, that's 6. Me, my dad, my brother, my mom, all 6 of those relationships deepened and became more magnificent and just wonderful over the last 18 months, beyond what I could have expected. And I have with me this gift of beautiful relationships with my mother and my brother, ongoing, where there's a lot more to unfold. And of course, there's more to unfold with my dad, too. I've always been really close to my dad. When I was a kid, I just, he had this way of bringing the world to me and to my brother and to lots of kids. But for me, it was just, I thought this was life. This is how it goes, and it is, right? He just had all these entrees to the wonder of the world. And, I felt often like I could read his mind. It was just wonderful. And then, in my 20s and 30s, I went off and did my own thing, but it was always with this sense of mutual trust between us that we were always there for each other. And I always assumed there was going to be a long set of chapters at the end where we would be catching up and doing new things and exploring. And there was actually in the last 17 months, just an immense amount that happened for me in terms of my relationship with my dad. And I have a lot of memories of, first of all, seeing him and my mother in a new way, understanding this true love. And also just this sense of shared delight and gratitude with me and my dad on this team having this adventure where, and the thing is, I was gonna say now that I was an adult, but it was really more like now that we were both kids. Yeah. So for the 4 of us, the last 17 months really has been our last great adventure. That was one of many. So it's kind of a cute picture. He liked that, one of the things he did love was the outdoors and athletics, and that we did a lot of hiking, which I'm very grateful for. And so he really was incredibly vigorous throughout the entire time. I mean, there was the last doctor he saw in Germany looked him in the eye 4 days before he died, and he said, "This is not a man who's dying." Because my dad squared the survival curve, as he's fond of saying. So vitality was not a long, slow ride down. It was him riding high, and then my metaphor is that this was a bullfight, and there came a point when there were too many bulls in the ring at the same time. There were times that he doubted, where he had pause, and he wondered if he'd be up for the job. But in the end, he was absolutely glorious and living until his last breath. And we were there with him, with Zach, his best friend. One of the things he liked to say, and then I'm going to shift over out of cancer, was that actually pancreatic cancer could be a fantastic experience, and that, like the Marine Corps, he highly recommended it as long as you could get out alive. So that touches back to the story that Kelly told about the Marine Corps. There was really this parallel track going on where he had been, in fact, not just once, but multiple times in smaller ways, faced with nearly impossible situations where the stakes were life and death, and where he got out. So of course, this is how he approached a pancreatic cancer diagnosis. Yeah, there were a couple times where, my life was endangered because he thought there would be fun adventures that then involved rock climbing with a baby on his shoulders, or running away from bulls. But we'll wait on those stories. You can ask me about them later. I want to say some of the qualities that come up for me, for my dad. One was this grabbing life intensely by the throat. But at the same time, he was also capable of being incredibly relaxed. So he could oscillate between being super intense and incredibly relaxed, in a way that I think could teach an electron a thing or two about the wave-particle duality. He also just found life exhilarating. It was just this miracle of existence, and he was there for it, which I think might be related to the whole, he was never stuck. He was always moving into, well, what's next and what happens here? My mom likes to say he was a bit like the squirrels in their backyard, always waking up in the morning, looking around, saying, okay, what's next? He relished life, and as you can see, anybody who was in here and looking at the slide deck, he was often smiling. It was just a way for him. And he was full of wonder and reverence for existence and gratitude, something that he and my mom shared. He really liked breaking rules. It's interesting that he was a logician, so he liked making axioms and figuring out theorems, but I think that his favorite thing about rules was when they weren't appropriate for what needed to happen, he'd figure out how to break them. And he was also really pretty good at being goofy. There's a very short story of him coming home. He was exuberant, all of these traits that I've just described. He'd had a fantastic day, and he took a flying leap onto the bed to celebrate his day, and on the way down, he saw the small lump, and he started contorting himself fantastically because he realized the small lump was me under the covers. Which I just, that picture, who does that? Who comes home after a day as an assistant professor or a graduate student, flies up in the air and then figures out how to not squish their baby daughter? The other thing, I think I'm going to end on one of my favorite traits of my dad. I'm not quite done, actually, so that ending thing is a bit of a cruel hoax, but he would naturally and spontaneously help others. So, he'd have his thing that he was focused on, but then something comes up and he sees it and he's right there to help you. And so to illustrate this point, I'm going to read one of the condolence cards we got. It came from Amy Went. So it's not the whole thing, but a part of it. So what she says is, one of the most significant, along with the support for my own career, was connecting Chris to the IceCube group in its early days. IceCube is this fantastic physics project that is this kilometer cube of detectors at the pole that are able to detect neutrinos, which are called ghost particles because they interact with so little. And so I'll come back to that. Terry stepped in at a time we really needed it. I'll never forget my surprise when Terry showed up at our house on a Saturday morning with the plan he had hatched. More than 15 years later, Chris thrives as both the technical heart and the conscience, part of it anyway, of IceCube. I believe it worked out as the mutual beneficial connection Terry originally envisioned. Another story I'd like to share is the airport story. I returned a call from Terry while at the Dane County Airport waiting for a flight to California. He started telling me about a project of some sort he wanted to recruit me for. I stopped him and explained I was distracted, having just put my two 10-year-olds on a plane as unaccompanied minors, traveling to Brussels where Chris would meet them. My interactions with the airline at the airport made me question whether they were really prepared. Without missing a beat, Terry started quizzing me about my backup plan in case they got stranded at O'Hare and immediately offered to drive to O'Hare and retrieve them. Fortunately, that wasn't necessary, but I was overwhelmed with gratitude for his generosity. Yeah, so, about 18 months ago, IceCube found a neutrino that set off this little ripple across the world to figure out kind of like a whodunit story. Where did this come from? And actually where it came from was TRX plus 56 plus 56, which maybe not as catchy as saying the most luminous object that humankind has yet discovered in the known universe. So it's off the left shoulder of Orion, and it's this thing called a blazar, which has this supermassive black hole in the middle, and it's oriented in such a way that it's spitting off neutrinos and probably cosmic rays in our direction every now and then. So I think, that's a fantastic thing for my dad to have been part of. He was part of a lot of projects. I'm going to mention Condor, which is another one. There's a whole list at the university here. Often what he would do is he would disrupt things and connect people and really delight in what would happen as a result. Yeah, so luminous. It's a great word for my dad. If I know probably there's some question for many of you, how could my dad have possibly died? What happened in the last couple of days? And it's a really intimate thing. What I'm going to say is that he was true to form. He just got brighter. And one of the things about somebody as luminous as him is that there's a lot of colors. There's all these different facets of Terry Millar. What I'm giving you is a daughter's perspective. I'm missing, for example, the perspective of things that generally had to do with guys. So bellowing at sports events or being drinking buddies or frisbee golf. So I think during the vignette section, when people come up with a short picture of Terry, that'll get covered a bit. But the main story is that he is this rainbow. He has all of these facets of light coming out of him and coming into our hearts. I'm going to say, if Terry were here doing this tribute, and he had to pick one aspect of his life to share, it would be the love of Susan Bulliard Millar. One of the greatest love stories ever. It's pure, sustaining, tender, mischievous, adventurous, passionate, sweet, courageous, and supportive. And then I step back and I say, well, of course he had one of the greatest love stories ever. Terry is extraordinary. And this is where it gets to the crux of the core, which is another thing he would say, which is, like, in the last 2 weeks, the thing I've been struggling with is, how can it go on without Terry? Isn't he necessary for the structure of the universe to work correctly? Like, how does it work? Isn't it shocking? Like, how does it work with him not here as a tour director or for telling silly stories or being like wildly inappropriate to get his point across about how much he loves you? Like, how does the world work without those things? There's a picture in my mom's high school yearbook where she's got kind of a funny face on, and he wrote in it, "Kids, your mom has that face because I'm pinching her." Wildly inappropriate demonstration of love. And of course, they met in fourth grade orchestra. And that thing my brother described about sublime is something that they experienced together in orchestra. And my dad will be the first to say that maybe nobody else listening experienced it. But they did, playing the Brahms First Concerto Symphony. It was a symphony, that's right. Together. So I'm getting near the end now, and what I want to come to is just to see, like, I want to come back to math. So Paula recounted this yesterday at the burial. Paula is his cousin, who's 2 years older than him, and they spent a lot of time together, including at their grandmother's house, Grandma Colliner. And I want to also honor Grandma Colliner because she was a mathematically inclined grandma who I think maybe gave him a bit of an inspiration and template for grandpa math and for being the grandpa he was. But Paula told us that when Terry was 4, he taught her multiplication and division when she was 6. So the thing that happens when he meets any kid or any human and they're willing to talk to him for a little bit and so they get a math lesson, that's been happening for a long time. I'm going to tell a story that's relevant to division, which is that Sterling, his grandson, had said, "Grandpa's in heaven, and he's learning what 1 divided by 0 is." How does he do that? Yes, that's right. So first, he learned how to count to infinity, and then I think the next time he'd learned that, and he was on to 1 divided by 0. Frank, who was also at my dad's burial, paid my dad the tribute of honoring him for helping him through college and especially through math. And I'm going to say that the last thing that he did in terms of grandpa math with Sarah, who was taking geometry, was trigonometry, which Frank also remembers with a special fondness. And I'm going to say, though, that it's not just those of us who are intimate, who are family or close friends, who have this extraordinary experience of my dad. I mean, he had an extraordinary relationship with the owner of Budget Bicycles. And it would just happen with, he and I were in Florida on a cancer trip, and we were in a limousine with a man named Richard. And we had a great time. Richard was we were really connecting. We found kind of a way to have an extra trip with Richard, kind of on purpose by accident on purpose. And on the last of our trips together, Richard disclosed that actually, even though he had a wonderful life and he'd found all kinds of success and he had a loving family and he'd started his own business, this was all from a background of people telling him he couldn't, that he'd never amount to anything. And he'd gotten over it, but he did have this, but he still couldn't count to 100 and he couldn't recite the alphabet. And my dad stopped and he looked up in the air and he said, okay, so Richard, here's what you do. If you have the number 13 and that's where it's hard to go on to 14, what you do is you take 13 and you add 1 and you get to 14. So he gave him this way of doing it. This is a man who's dyslexic, but he's very bright, and nobody had thought to tell him, you can get to the next number by adding 1. And then he went on from there, and he said, then once you nail counting, then make some boxes in your mind, and put the number 1 on the first box, paint it a bright color, put the number 2 on the second box, paint it blue if you painted the first one red, make 24 boxes, and then open each box up, and inside the first box will be A. Inside the second box will be B. And Richard just lit up, and he started crying, and he said, this is going to work. I'm going to learn how to count, and I'm going to learn my alphabet. And I'm still going to have my business and my family and my success. So this was my dad. There's little bits of him in all of us. There's some part inside of your heart which has got a little song of Terry Millar in it. And it's the part that you reach to when something in your head or some other person says, you can't do that. And you reach to that part and you say, can I do that? And it's going to say, yes, you can. So that's what he did for Richard. That's what he does for all of us. And in addition to remembering him, we can also remember that part and actually live with him in a continued conversation. So my dad died in Germany. He died before we were able to do the final systemic therapy that we were looking at doing. He died on the way back home. We were headed home, and it wasn't giving up. We figured out a way of doing the systemic therapy here. We were in the airport at Frankfurt, within 200 meters of every metaphor for transportation known to humankind. We were in a hotel that was shaped like an enormous boat. There was a highway. There was a train station. His last words were, I want to rock and roll. As my brother said, the last music he listened to was that Bach suite. And the last symbolic gesture that he made was handing the love of his life a beautiful, long-stemmed red rose. So to honor his spirit and his memory, what you can do is to spend more time with the children in your life, including yourself, and leave large tips.
And we have a few moments now for the sharing of your memories and your stories. If you'd care to briefly share with us, we're going to begin with Terry's friend Zach. When you come forward, if you'll just use the microphone here so we can all hear you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Terry had a very distinctive attitude toward life. And the only way in which I can describe it to you, at least briefly, is to give you a historical example from ancient Greek philosophy. Democritus and Heraclitus were two pre-Socratic philosophers who shared a similar view of human existence. They regarded human beings as being fundamentally vain and foolish. However, they had different reactions to that human condition. So that Heraclitus regarded the condition of man as being tragic and full of pathos. And so whenever he went out into public, he always did so with a gloomy, downcast expression and a tear in his eye. Democritus, however, regarded the human condition as fundamentally ridiculous and absurd. And so when he went out into the world, it was always with laughter, with a smile on his face, and with a twinkle in his eye. Terry was a Democritean. And except I would embellish upon that by saying that he did not simply view human existence as absurd, he viewed it as sublimely absurd, as miraculously absurd. And I would have to say in all modesty that I shared that sense of absurdity with him, so that whenever we got together, we would always end up laughing hysterically, generally about our own foibles. This attitude of his enabled him, I think, to endure his illness with a modicum of humor. So it served him well, I think, in the long run. And to give you an example of how he endured his illness, when he called to say that he had stage 4 cancer, he prefaced that news by saying, "It looks like I'll be checking out early." When he ended up in the emergency room with a blocked artery, which could have easily been fatal, he said, "Cancer has 500 different ways to kill you." And when he learned that the lesion on his liver was growing exponentially, he quipped, "It's coming to get me." This attitude was not mere bravado in the face of absurdity, but it was a deeply held view of life. And he expressed it to me on more than one occasion, always in the many years that I've known him. This attitude toward life came across, especially when we were about to do things, the two of us, that were remarkably stupid. He would always say to me, "Don't take it so seriously. It's only life." It's only life. That's a very paradoxical attitude, but it enabled him to throw himself into everything that he did with a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eye. Thank you.
These are reflections from Terry and Susan's dear friend Elaine Seymour for Terry. There was nothing small about Terry Millar. He only came in one size, extra large. He was a big man in every way, a Renaissance man who infused his distinguished intellectual and professional life with commitment and creative energy, but balanced these with a rich capacity for loving and loyal relationships with his family and friends. In my favorite photo of Terry, he's holding one of his new grandchildren, cradling the baby's back against his face and chest in his strong hands with such tenderness. He adored his wife Susan, his children, and his grandchildren, and had a soft spot for the rest of us. Others will write about his gifts as a mathematician. I can only recount his patience in trying to teach me some math thing he happened to be thinking about when I visited, and his profound belief that if he tried hard enough, I would eventually get it. He would nail me over breakfast to talk about his latest projects, but always took an intelligent interest in mine. When he retired from senior administration, he promptly went back to teaching mathematics, and I think he never stopped teaching. He loved the signs of math ability and engagement in his grandchildren and tended these with relish to the end of his life. He was a handsome man, with or without his beard, and his physical energy was legendary. I have a mental snapshot of him sitting on the edge of the pavement outside his house, on top of a pile of snow, hauling on his rollerblades. And on our archaeological trip to Turkey, he got me up and down monuments and mountainsides that I would never have managed on my own. We were always the last to arrive, but he didn't care. It was on these occasions that I got some sense of why he was a good Marine and why he enjoyed it so. No one was going to get left behind. We were all going to make it. Terry had eclectic tastes and pursued them all with gusto. He was a great host, an imaginative cook. When he cooked for you, you got the works. He loved classical music, but he also loved football, and late at night would call my partner John, also a Marine, to pursue a running rivalry over the Green Bay Packers versus the Denver Broncos. He loved driving fast and bad action movies, and bought a flashy electric car and a huge TV to enjoy them. But what he couldn't do was tell a short story. He liked to start with Adam and Eve and walk you through the twists and turns of the action until he dragged you exhausted to the punchline. This could take some time. He did not go gently into that good night and took on his cancer with the singleness of purpose and grit that defined him. Nor is it easy to let him go. Somehow the word gone does not compute. I was blessed to be with him one last time in February when the storms that closed Chicago Airport gave me a serendipitous chance to have Terry and Susan to stay with me for 2 days in my home in Sherborne, England. Our conversations ranged widely, but at one point, he told his story about how he beat the Vietnam War draft by joining the Marines ahead of time. He loved to recount the battles of will that he fought and lost with his drill sergeant. And somehow, that's the metaphor that I hold in my mind of his last few weeks of life. In the end, he lost the argument, but he wasn't going to make it easy for the higher authorities. Semper Fi, dear Terry. Always Semper Fi. Love, Elaine.
Hi there, I'm Jim McGloin, and I will represent the McGloin family, my wife Naomi, daughter Lisa and son Peter, granddaughter Casey, now a freshman in college, and Preston Sowell, Lisa's sweetheart. We are here today to memorialize Terry Millar, who has been a rare and special gift to the world and to all of us who have known and loved him. He has made our lives better in countless ways and helped us become who we are today. For the McGloin family, Terry has been a part of our lives for 42 years. His devotion to Susan, his lifetime love, goes back 55 years and maybe even 61. But at 70, he has left us too soon for a man who still had so much more to give. Our hearts are broken and our world is much poorer for our loss of Terry. But we'll keep him always as our teacher and mentor on how to live authentically and well, with integrity, courage, and love of life, and we'll always love him dearly. Now, I just wanted to tell a story that's already been touched on in various ways, but I'd just like to tell it in my own way from my experience with Terry, is that he told me that he had his eye on Susan from the time they were in the 4th grade as the one for him. And by 15, he was in hot pursuit. And Susan told me about that same story you heard about in the yearbook, what he wrote in there. But then after graduation from high school, they went off to college, to different colleges about an hour's drive away from each other. And I think during that time, Susan's affection strayed, and she was dating another guy. And Terry found this very distressing, if not heartbreaking, and he felt he needed then to change his life by leaving school and joining the Marines, no matter that we were in the height of the Vietnam War. And his parents didn't know he was not up at Cornell studying until they got a call from Parris Island, South Carolina, and he was in boot camp with the Marines. That was a shock, as you can imagine. And he went through all the training, and then as you heard, you get an MOS, a military occupational specialty assignment in a number at the end of your training. And when he saw his number, he said to the Sarge, "What does this mean, Sarge?" And he said, "Son, that means you're going to die." And Terry, in his characteristic attitude, thought, well, what's next? And the forward artillery observer is a very lethal position because you're out beyond the friendly forces, out in the lap of the enemy, so to speak, drawing fire down on targets. And he thought, if I'm going to be in the lap of the enemy, I might as well know their language. So he enrolled in the Army Language School and delayed his deployment to Vietnam, and also came well armed with language when he arrived. He got to headquarters and he saw a sign, "Help Wanted," in the Civil Affairs office for a clerk who could type and speak Vietnamese. And he got the job. And then he looked and saw that they had a whole stack of applications for a civil affairs officer they were looking for. And he saw a fellow Ivy Leaguer from Yale, captain out in the rice paddies fighting, and put his application on the very top. And he got the job as a civil affairs officer. So quickly he got himself and another person out of a position of having to kill or be killed, and to come back from their tour of duty in Vietnam relatively intact, both physically and mentally. So that was the story. You know, he made it through Vietnam, came back. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention is, while he's in the Marines, he calls Susan, who's at college, and tells her, you know, now that I'm in the Marines, if you'll marry me now, the extra income will pay for your college education. And this time she said yes. And so off he goes then to Vietnam, and after he comes through safely, he comes home to Susan, and the rest is history. Until the cancer diagnosis, which came soon after his 69th birthday, and he faced it the same way he did his MOS in the Marines. And you heard that with the help of a lot of other people, and probably chiefly Jessica, who choreographed the whole process of his healing, his fight with cancer, he came through it in characteristic style, and Zach really captured very well that attitude with which he faced life and how he handled love. especially his love for Susan. I mean, I think it's embodied in Shakespeare's Sonnet 116, which starts out with, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Because, and with, how does it go? Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove. It was disappointing and hurtful maybe, but he never gave up where Susan was concerned. And you saw that when he called her again and didn't hesitate to propose again. And this time he won her hand, and happily ever after. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here. I'm his baby brother, Bruce. He may have told you some stories about me, which we can talk about later, and I might be able to correct some mistakes he had in those stories last year. There's a couple of things I just want to elaborate on. I did promise my brother last year that I was going to try to make you smile, on this occasion. So that's what I'm going to try to do. One of the things I want to elaborate on is how quick of a learner my brother was. It was quite obvious even when he was little. He learned very, very rapidly. And we brought up the Marine Corps, so I have to add a little story about the Marine Corps, which is an illustration of how rapidly he learned. Well, the drill sergeant, he told me one time, saw him in boot camp chewing his nails, and anybody that knew him when he was a young boy all the way up until the Marine Corps, he chewed his nails. He hardly had a nail left on his fingers. Drill sergeant said, "Millar, front and center." My brother walks up. "Yes." And he goes, "Are you chewing your nails, Millar?" "Yes." "Marines don't chew their nails, Millar." "Yes." "I'm going to stop you from chewing your nails, Millar." "Yes, follow me." He took my brother over to the latrine and had him immerse his hands in the latrine. And he only let him wash his hands prior to the next meal, and right after the next meal, he had to immerse his hands again in the latrine. Well, to prove my brother learned quickly, he never chewed his nails again after the first immersion. That was quick. One of my brother's favorite things, I should raise this just a little bit. One of his favorite words, and I'm surprised I didn't hear it repeated here today, was when my brother was confronted with frustration or confusion or anything, he would always, one of his favorite words was bummer. Bummer. And I'm sure, excellent, thank you, Matt. I'm sure that his reaction to the outcome of his battle with his cancer, I think the first thing he would say was, "This wasn't in the plan, bummer." I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. He would call me on occasion throughout my life, to keep track of me and make sure if I was still on the same path, the right path. And he'd go, "Well, little brother, how's life going?" And sometimes I'd say, "Well, not so good." He would say, "Well, what's the matter?" And I would say, "Well, for example, I woke up this morning, I went to get my truck, there was 4 flat tires on the truck, I was trying to get to work, so I ran down the road to get to work on time. Truck ran me over. I broke both my legs. I finally crawled to work, got to work, and my boss fired me." My brother go, "Bummer." "What are you going to do about it?" I said, "Well, I don't know." And this is the beauty of my brother. He always had a plan. He always came up with a plan. he said, well, you don't know what you're going to do? He says, here's what you do. You go to the hospital, get those 2 legs fixed, go home, fix the flats on that truck, hop in that truck, and drive around and look for a new job, right? That's the solution. To elaborate a little bit on Terry and Susan, I was fortunate enough to meet Terry when I was 4 years old. I'm going to say 4 years old because that's my farthest back memory that I have of him. And because of that, I have a little different perspective and a little different insight and a hell of a lot of good stories for you guys if you're interested afterwards. But when my brother hit puberty, things started to change. I noticed he got more determined. He was dedicated more. He was just striving to learn more. But it was that dedication, determination, and drive that impressed me the most and was highly beneficial to me. And I'll elaborate on that. When he was 15 or 16, I was 12 or 13, and he would sneak out of the house at night, in the middle of the night, and one time I caught him, and he would be back early in the morning. He'd be back before daylight in the morning. He'd leave at 10 o'clock at night, in the middle of the winter I'm talking about. And he wouldn't tell me where he was going. He just always told me not to tell Mom and Dad. So I didn't tell Mom and Dad. Well, one weekend, he had snuck out of the window. I decided to follow those tracks. I went across the field, 300 or 400 yards, through the woods, through the snow, across the creek, up a hill, over another hill, through some more woods, across the road, through another field, and the tracks of my brother led to a little house on Metzger Drive, which, for those of you who don't know, was Susan Bulliard's residence. And that became lucrative for me because now I knew, not only monetarily, but I love chocolate chip cookies, and the chocolate chip cookies in our house were apportioned, and you can have 6, Terry, you can have 6, Leslie, you can have 6, Bruce. Well, I ended up with 12 for a couple of years. And I know $1 isn't much now, but back then you could buy, five bottles of pop for $1. So I bring that story up because that's just an illustration. When he had his mind set on something, he set out to accomplish it, including this battle with the cancer. You might also have known, if you notice my brother, he's a very handsome man. Nobody really brought that up today. But one of the things that made him handsome, which enabled him, he was not only smart, but he was handsome. And that enabled him, I believe, to land one of the prettiest, smartest girls in Orchard Park, Susan. So one of the features of his face that you may or may not ever have recognized, but now that I pointed out, I'm sure when you look at photos, you're going to go, aha, was a little dimple on his chin. The little dimple on his chin was the result of his chin traveling through space and time and connecting with the trajectory of a wildly launched arrow by his little brother, me, and it caught him right dead square in the middle of the chin, which gave him that Kirk Douglas rounded out chin look. There was I had so many things to say, but here's what my brother meant to me. And I've heard it today, I heard it yesterday. He was just an incredibly wonderful person. Always there to help you. Always, I mean, he wanted to learn, help. I got a kick out of that story where, give me a minute, he elaborated. If you ask him what was 1 + 1, first you got to learn the history of mathematics. I wasn't his best student, by the way. As a matter of fact, I was probably the hardest student he ever had. When I actually had to call him last fall and ask him to remind me of how to square off a rectangle in the corners. And he gave me, of course, a big math lesson over the phone, the Paragon theorem and this and that. But anyhow, picture me as a little 4-year-old when I first met my brother. I've been wanting to go with my little brother through the woods and through the trees and across the creeks with him and his little buddies. Well, they were older than me. I was 4 or 5, they were 9 or 10. And I'll never forget, and this will stick with me the rest of my life, the first time I was allowed to follow my brother out of the house. I'm sure my mother said, take your little brother with you and keep an eye on him. But I don't look at it that way. I look at it this way. I followed my brother through the fields in Wyandotte, Michigan. The grass was high. My little legs were short. My brother was a little taller. And every once in a while, he'd get ahead of me where I couldn't see him. And then fear would set in, as a little tyke, you can imagine. But every single time, just about the time I was about ready to cry, a hand would reach down, a smiling face, that same smile you see on the screen. You're okay, just follow me. I'm here to help you. Come on, let's go, follow me. Keep up with me. He kept pushing me, pushing me, pushing me. And every time he'd go over that hill or across that creek, or a hill that I couldn't climb or a creek I couldn't cross, he'd come back and get me and help me up that hill, help me across that creek. And he did that throughout the rest of my life. Yesterday, I followed him up a hill, and I was able to walk back down that hill because of the confidence my brother gave me all my life, that I can do it, and he doesn't have to be there to help me do it. We can all do it without him. We can continue the love of people that he had, the inspiration that he gave us to teach other people, interact with other people. We all can do it. I know we can. That's what he would want us to do. So, this is a bummer, but that's the plan. Thank you all.
Hello, I'm Millar. I'm a retired math professor, and Susan asked me to read a note from Paul Ludden, but I think I'm going to preface it and tell you who Paul Ludden is, in a little bit of context. So Terry and I first met when we were both postdocs in the math department, and the math department had at least 60 professors at that time, but we were in a smaller group of mathematical logicians, maybe about 6. So right from the beginning, we were very close mathematical colleagues, but very soon we were even closer friends. And now, in those days, we all lived in the university houses, which is a faculty housing for temporary faculty. It's actually about a half mile from here. And it's a small group of apartment houses. And Terry, the Millars and the Roberts were living very close by apartments. And actually, they had moved to Madison the year before we came, and so they already knew each other. And of course, they also had daughters named Jessica. There's Jessica Roberts and Jessica Millar. I think you guys are pretty close to the same age. They were both toddlers when we came. And Matthew had just been born shortly before. But anyway, Terry and Gary introduced me to the game that they called the Sport of Kings. Or maybe it was the King of Sports, I'm not sure. Frisbee golf. And it was kind of a joke, Sport of Kings. Regular golf is kind of expensive. You have a lot of equipment and greens fees. Frisbee golf, you have a frisbee and that's it. You're ready to play. And they set up a course right at university houses. It was in the backyards, between the apartment houses and the playground, all through there. And we started to play, and I remember my favorite hole was the sandbox. Now, in Frisbee golf, it's like golf, in that you throw your Frisbee instead of hitting a golf ball, and then you walk over and pick it up and throw it again, and continue until you hit some target or goal. Usually it was a tree or something. But my favorite hole was the sandbox hole. University Houses is on a small hill, kind of a gentle, and in the backyard it's sort of sloped down to a playground area. And in the playground area there was a sandbox. And so for that hole, we would stand up on top of the hill and throw our Frisbees way down and try to land them in the sandbox. And so it was one of the few holes where if you had a really good throw, you could get a hole in one. But as you can imagine, there was a drawback that quite often there would be small children playing in the sandbox. Now, when there was just one child, one of us would run down the hill and stand in front of the child, and the others would throw their Frisbee, and if the Frisbee came anywhere near the child, the person down below would swat it away. But we had a lot of fun. I couldn't resist telling one story about one of our more memorable games for the several math professors I see in the crowd. So we were having a dinner party, and several couples were invited besides Terry and Susan. Walter Rudin and his wife, Marianne Rudin, were there. And I think Walter was kind of intrigued by Terry's very enthusiastic stories all about the king of sports, and he went on, and Walter finally decided, well, he would play. And I looked it up this morning, and at the time, Walter was 57 years old. And I remember thinking at that time, what an old guy that is. And now I think, oh, he's not that old. I mean, but he was a dignified man, but he liked to have fun. And so we took him out and we played. And I wanted to note a few things about it. First of all, it was the winter time, so there was snow on the ground and ice on the sidewalks. And in fact, during the game, it even sprinkled a little snow, which was very pleasant. And it was after dinner, so it was the middle of the night. Now, I should point out that during dinner we finished several bottles of wine, and that was very helpful. But so we went out and we were playing Frisbee golf, and we would hold a flashlight in one hand, and we would throw the Frisbee and try to keep the Frisbee in the light so we could find it. But it was a lot of fun, and I have to say that every time I was with Terry, it was a lot of fun. He was just that kind of guy. Now, eventually, we finished our postdoctoring, and I took a job, a tenure-track job at the University of Texas, and my wife, Manly, and our 6-month-old daughter, Tamara, went and lived in Austin. And at the same time, Gary Roberts, our other player, he took a job in New York with Merck Labs Research, a big pharmaceutical company. And I suppose some other interesting things happened in Texas. My son was born there 3 years later. And then eventually, after about 5 years, I got tenure. And right about that time, the math department here offered me a job. And I'm sure it was with the encouragement of Terry. He was very nice about things like that. And I came back, and at the exact same time, Gary came back to the bacteriology department. And we again, the three of us took up Frisbee golf. This time we were playing at Westmoreland, which is a small Madison Park, city of Madison Park, very close to here. And we played for years, every weekend. And I think soon after that, Gary convinced one of his younger colleagues, Paul Ludden, who was in biochemistry, to join us. And so we had this foursome that played for many years. And then later on, Paul left Madison and he took an administrative job at the University of California. But he would come back from time to time and we'd play. And I think he was a pretty good administrator because he then became the provost at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Now, about 4 or 5 years ago, Gary, Terry, and I all retired within a short period of time, and about the same time, Paul stopped being a provost and went back to teaching biochemistry at SMU. And one other thing he did was he and his wife Linda bought a house, a condominium out in Middleton, where they spent most of their summers in Madison, and we again played golf again. Now I think he probably did that because Dallas is really, really hot in the summer, but maybe it was because his daughter lives here. More likely, I guess. But anyway, Paul is younger than us. He's going to retire next year. And I want to read this note from Paul that he wrote. Terry Millar. Terry was part of a foursome that played disc golf on and off for several decades. The physical science team consisted of Millar and Millar, while the biological sciences was Roberts and Ludden. We played through injuries, mishaps, and weather. As the game caught on, several dedicated courses were developed in the Madison area at Elver Park, Capitol Springs, and so on. But perhaps the most fun was had at the original course in Westmoreland Park. The big tree through the brush and over the pond was hole number 1. Next followed by the second tree on the left at the street side, and then the tree with the branch at the side of the woods, then the corner pole of the tennis court. That was always a favorite, except with the tennis players. The tetherball pole, and then the flag pole, ever Terry's nemesis. And finally, the big rock at the entrance to the park. Passerbys would look in awe, parentheses, perhaps amusement, at 4 aging profs throwing plastic discs around with no apparent purpose. Sometimes in the rain, sometimes in the snow. Terry was infamous for picking up the wrong frisbee after a hole, only to realize his mistake after several minutes of the rest of us searching in the woods or the weeds for the errant disc. No one ever doubted the honesty of his mistake. He was just too nice a fellow to do that on purpose. I should point out, we finally learned to always say, Terry, is my disc in your golf bag? Saved a lot of time. If there was a weakness to Terry's game, it was his putting. He would occasionally hit the basket from 50 or more feet away, but a shot inside of 12 feet was gold for the other team. We were amazed when we learned from Terry's military record that he had earned marksman status with the rifle. This from a man who could not confidently deposit a 10-inch plastic disc in a basket 10 feet away. The game will not be the same without Terry, and we will never again be treated to an exposition such as, quote, so if x is a positive integer greater than 1, the set of values that describes our scores today can only be satisfied if x is the exponent of another positive integer equal to ... end quote. He was a uniquely interesting and wonderful man. Terry loved playing disc golf with friends and whatever family he could convince to come out to the course. He was always ready to play another 18. He had a positive attitude, and someone dropping by casually would not know the battle he was waging with cancer. He even brought humor to his condition. It was customary for members of the group to note aches and pains at the beginning of a match to pre-explain impending poor play. Once this past summer, I noted a paper cut on my throwing hand during the walk to the first hole. Terry responded, "Gee, Paul, a paper cut. That's tough. My cancer is killing me." Before and after his disease, he brought the same positive outlook to the game that he brought to his scholarship, his teaching, his mentorship, his work in the graduate school, and to his family life. In his last year, Matt often joined the group, and it was heartwarming to see the bond between father and son. For the record, on a day in late December 2018, Terry had the best score of the group at his last round of disc golf. Terry, his son Matt, his grandson Sterling, Arnie Millar, and I played on a sunny but chilly December 30th day at the course in Middleton. Terry had beaten death several times and relished the opportunity to be out with his son and grandson and friends. The first 9 holes were rough, and Terry fell behind, but in the second 9, he rallied like so many times and added a birdie to pull out the best individual score for the day. He went out a winner, as he did in life.
Thank you. It's time for me to do my duck walk across the floor in order to get from one place to another in my small apartment. This poem was memorized by my mother, and it's called When Earth's Last Picture is Painted. When Earth's last picture is painted and the tubes are twisted and dried, when the oldest colors have faded and the youngest critic has died, we shall rest, and faith, we shall need it, lie down for an eon or two, till the master of all good workmen shall put us to work anew. And those that were good shall be happy. They shall sit in the golden chair. They shall splash at a 10-league canvas with brushes of comet's hair. They shall find real saints to draw from, Magdalene, Peter, and Paul. They shall work for an age at a sitting and never be tired at all. And only the master shall praise us, and only the master shall blame. And no one shall work for money, and no one shall work for fame, but each for the joy of this working, and each in his separate star shall draw the thing as he sees it, for the God of things as they are. Thank you.
Hi, I'm George Baker. I'm Jessica's business partner of 10 years. And I've known Terry all of that time. Terry has been an integral part of 2 of Jessica's biggest projects. Jessica's 2 biggest projects. So the first was the business that we started together about 10 years ago. Closer. Okay. Terry was a friend, an investor, a senior advisor, and babysitter-in-chief for V-Charge. As an advisor, as a senior advisor, he brought a kind of perspective and balance that the 2 of us as novice entrepreneurs really value tremendously. And as babysitter-in-chief, he actually, it would either, the girls would come out here to stay with Terry and Susan, or Terry would come to Rhode Island to stay with the girls, or sometimes Terry would come on the road with us. I remember one trip in particular, in Mid-Coast, Maine, Terry came along to try and spell Jess so that she could go to some business meetings. Except that this was the first time, this was the Laura Rose, this was a 9-month-old Laura Rose. Except that this was the first time that Laura Rose had ever taken a bottle. Now, any of you who know Laura Rose know that this is going to be a very serious challenge. But Terry took on this challenge, and with grace and caring and cajoling and I don't quite know what, he succeeded, and he succeeded very well. He was remarkable. We sold the business 2 years ago. We did not make Terry and Susan rich, which is something we had hoped to do, but we didn't go bankrupt either. And Jessica and I, along with Terry's colleague, Chris DeMarco, continue our work trying to make it possible for the world's electric grids to get more renewable energy on them, which is a great thing. But Jessica's second big project was even more important and more successful. And what she has done, she and Terry put together a team with Matt and Susan that included friends, family, advisors from all over the world who a month before were total strangers to them, a team of doctors. There must have been 20 people in this group, with Terry serving as CEO and Jessica serving as, head of strategy and operations. They managed to allow Terry to have about 17 months of life and joy, and give joy to all of us who were lucky enough to be part of that and to be part of that experience. We got a note, Jessica got a note, from a colleague that I want to read, who's a colleague of ours at V-Charge. And this is, he's in Chennai, India, and so I'll read this to finish. I remember the time when Ashish and I were visiting in Madison, and we both went on a bike ride one evening with Terry. While both of us really struggled hard to keep up with, these are two young men, by the way. Both of us struggled hard to keep up with him. He was enjoying the ride and busy telling stories. When we got back, drained of all of our energy and a little sore, at least Ashish and I were, I really wondered where Terry got all of that energy. And I thought, I'll consider my life a success if I have half the energy, wit, and stories to tell. I read this in a book. It's called The Rule of Nights. Quote, life is a long series of farewells. Only the circumstances should surprise us. A knight concerns himself with gratitude for the life he has been given. He does not fear death, for the work one night begins, others will finish.
Hi, my name is Leslie Millar Flanagan. Terry was my big brother. Bruce is my other big brother. I was the baby. And I am going to read something that Susie wrote about my brother. I will say he's 8 years older than me, and so basically Susan's been in my life my entire life that I remember, and they were always the model that I would look up to for where I would want to go in a relationship. And my husband Chip and I have been married almost 40 years. Didn't start in 4th grade, but we started dating at 16. But I told Susie I would be glad to read this because it, I think, sums up kind of what everyone has been saying and for the relationship that they had. This is Susan now. Yes, I feel overwhelmed with grief for the loss of my Terry. At the same time, I feel overwhelmingly grateful. I am grateful for Terry, who intensely and unfailingly twined his life with mine for some 55 years of fantastic love and life. I wouldn't trade a moment of my life with this best of all partners, and I will cherish my memories of him for the rest of my life. I am grateful for Jessica and Matthew, whom he nurtured and loved with all his might all their lives. For Jessica and Matthew, who returned his love with their amazing care and who continue to care for me and each other. In countless ways, Jessica and Matthew bless us, and we are also blessed by their children and spouses. I am grateful for all the family members and friends who shared with Terry the good times and the bad, the challenges, the mathematics and physics, the care, curiosity, and courage, the laughter, the work, the music, the play, the games, especially Frisbee golf, the hiking, biking, cooking, and so much more. And now that cancer has taken him from us, I feel grateful to each of you for your care. Love, Susan.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Susan. I know there are many, many more stories to tell. And we will have time during the reception out in the Commons for you to continue sharing those stories. I invite you now to turn in your programs to see the lyrics for the song Teach Your Children. We invite you to join in singing. Today we have celebrated Terry Millar, a man who reveled in the small graces, in the kindness of strangers and the love of friends, who knew the beauty in a sunrise and the gift of another day. Terry walked among us with compassion and courage and grace, and now he belongs to the ages. When so loving a figure has been a part of our experience, life has given more than death could ever take away. Though it will seem strange for the world to turn and for our lives to proceed without him, let us be reassured that Terry's spirit dwells always in our hearts. Let us seek in love to carry forward his memory in the lives we now lead, for our lives are his honor and memorial. The sparkle and the light that shone from his eyes, his curiosity and his compassion, we now hold within us. May we be more ready, because of his caring nature, to lend a helping hand, to make someone else's life a little easier, their load a little lighter by a kind word or a supportive deed. No tribute, no memorial to a lost loved one is more fitting than this, that we each go forth from here alive with a desire to be more of a blessing to the world. When you think of Terry, spend some time with your family. Create memories with children and grandchildren, with all those you love. Take what inspires you and share it with others. Having commended him to the ages, we recognize with deep reverence a life well lived, a life filled with integrity and joy. From the earth he came, and to the earth he has returned. Today we dedicate Terry's memory and we hold him close within us. The light he brought and the love he gave is ours to give away to others with his memory and his heart as our guide. We close our service with these words of Mary Oliver. Look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds, and every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have learned in my lifetime leads back to this: the fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends upon it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. May peace be with Terry, with Susan, Matthew, and Jessica, with all those in Terry's circle of love and concern. And may peace be, at last, with us all. Blessed be, and amen.
surrender.